Story 1. Wendigo. His gas station, the jerky tasted like winter itself. Trucker Danny Martinez spat the strip of meat into the snow behind mile marker 127, but the flavor clung to his teeth like ice that would not melt. Cold meat, cold blood, cold hunger that made his stomach clench with needs he could not name. The gas station squatted against the Dalton Highway like a tumor on the tundra. Hand-painted sign read, "Last stop before Dead Horse." But Danny had driven this route for 15 years. There had never been a station at mile 127 before. The attendant inside looked normal enough. Flannel shirt, work boots, smile that belonged on someone selling snacks to truckers making the haul to Prudhoe Bay. But his eyes held depths that reminded Danny of frozen lakes. Dark water beneath ice thick enough to hold 18-wheelers. "Try the jerky," the man had said. Local recipe, made from animals that adapt to the cold. Now Danny stood beside his rig, spitting blood and meat into snow that steamed like it was hot. The jerky had tasted wrong from the first bite. Not beef, not deer, something that had lived and died in temperatures that killed normal animals. His radio crackled with static. Base dispatch trying to reach him, but the frequency was flat. Instead of traffic updates, Danny heard voices calling from somewhere in the Arctic darkness. Truckers he knew, drivers who had disappeared on the Dalton over the past year, all of them asking for directions to mile 127. Danny climbed back into his cab and gunned the engine. Whatever that gas station was selling, he wanted distance between himself and the taste still crawling through his mouth. But as he drove north, the hunger grew stronger. Not for food, for something colder. Mile 128 passed. Mile 130. The gas station should have been shrinking in his mirrors. But when Danny checked, it was still there. Same distance. Same flickering neon sign casting red light across snow that looked black in the Arctic night. He pressed harder on the accelerator. The speedometer climbed past 70, past 80. But the gas station maintained its position like it was painted on the world itself. Danny, SCB radio sparked to life. His own voice, distorted by cold that turned words into ice. "This is Danny Martinez requesting assistance at mile 127. I need directions to the station. I need more of that jerky. I need to understand what it is made from." But Danny had not touched his radio. His hands were locked on the steering wheel, fighting to maintain control of a rig that wanted to turn around. That wanted to return to the station where the attendant waited with meat from animals that should not exist. The hunger twisted deeper. Danny's body temperature began to drop even with the heater running full blast. His breath formed clouds in the cab. Ice crystals formed on the inside of the windshield despite the defroster working overtime. He was changing. The jerky had not been food. It had been infection. Danny pulled over at mile 135 and checked his logbook. According to his GPS, he had been driving for 3 hours. But the logbook showed he had been parked at mile 127 for the past 6 days. Page after page of entries he did not remember writing. Tried the jerky. Need more. The attendant knows what I'm becoming. He is helping me understand. In the mirror, his eyes had taken on depths that reminded him of frozen lakes. His skin had turned pale as fresh snow. When he opened his mouth, his breath came out in clouds that formed shapes, almost like words in a language older than English. The radio crackled again. This time the voice was clearer. "The missing trucker from last month. Danny, you need to come back to the station. The attendant has answers about what we becoming, about what the cold makes possible when you stop fighting it." Danny tried to remember what Wendigo legend said about hunger that could not be satisfied. About people who ate things that changed them from the inside out. But the memories felt warm and human and increasingly irrelevant. The gas station appeared in his headlights. Mile 127 again. Impossible. But there it was. The attendant stood in the doorway, smiling with teeth that gleamed like fresh ice. Behind him, shapes moved through the store. Former truckers who had stopped for jerky and stayed to learn what they were becoming. Danny parked beside pumps that dispensed something thicker than gasoline. The attendant approached with movements too smooth for human joints. "The jerky is working," he said with sounds that came from somewhere deeper than vocal cords. "You ready for the next step?" Inside the store, display cases held meat from animals that evolution had never produced. Strips of flesh that pulsed with their own cold life. Organs from creatures that existed only in temperatures where normal biology failed. Danny's new hunger focused on meat that steamed with cold instead of heat. Protein from things that thrived in environments where warmth meant death. He ate until his body temperature matched the Arctic air, until his breath came out in clouds that formed words in languages predating human speech. The transformation completed at dawn. Danny looked in the store, a mirror, and saw something that had once been human. Pale as fresh snow, eyes deep as frozen lakes, teeth designed for meat that fought back. He walked outside to find a dozen trucks parked around the station. Other drivers who had stopped for jerky and discovered they were being recruited. All of them changed now. All of them understanding what the cold made possible when you stopped fighting it. The attendant handed Danny keys to a refrigerated trailer. Time for deliveries, he said. Gas stations across the highway system. Truck stops where drivers get hungry for something different. Danny drove south with cargo that pulsed with cold life. Behind him, other trucks followed. All of them carrying jerky to gas stations where curious truckers would try local recipes. The Wendigo had learned to adapt. Instead of hunting individuals in frozen forests, it had discovered supply chains, distribution networks, ways to spread hunger through the very systems humans use to stay fed. Mile marker 127 disappeared in Danny's mirrors, but it would reappear wherever hungry drivers needed to understand what the cold made possible. The jerky was just the beginning. Story 2. Alaska Highway. As Phantom Hitchhiker, the ice was already forming on Mark's passenger seat when he realized the woman was gone. He slammed on the brakes, his 18-wheeler jackknifing across both lanes of the Alaska Highway. Steam rose from his breath inside the cab. The heater had been running full blast for the past hour, but the temperature gauge read -40. Impossible. It was July. Mark had picked her up at mile marker 15. A young woman in a thin summer dress, shivering beside the road like she had been walking for hours. No coat, no shoes, just bare feet on the asphalt that should have burned in the summer heat. But when she climbed into his truck, the cab filled with winter. Now she was gone, vanished somewhere between mile marker 36 and 37. The exact spot where 3 other truckers claimed their hitchhiker disappeared. The spot where Mark had sworn he would never stop. But there she had been. Real as frostbite. Real as the ice now coating his dashboard. Mark grabbed his CB radio. Breaker 19. This is Big Bear. Anyone else seeing weird stuff on the highway tonight? Static answered. Then a voice he recognized. Old Pete, who had been driving this route for 30 years. Mark, get out of there. Right now. Do not look back. Pete. She was in my truck. I felt her sitting there. Cold as death, but real. They all feel real, son. That is the problem. Mark looked at his passenger seat. The vinyl was cracked and split where the ice had formed. Frost covered the window in patterns that looked almost like faces. Screaming faces. Pete, what the hell is she? The radio crackled. When old Pete spoke again, his voice shook. Her name was Sarah Mitchell. 22 years old. Died in a car crash right here at mile marker 37. Winter of 1986. Been hitchhiking ever since. Mark felt his blood turn to slush. Died how? Froze to death. Took them 3 days to find her body in the snow. She had been walking toward the road, trying to get help, wearing nothing but a summer dress. The temperature in Mark's cab dropped another 10 degrees. He could see his breath now. Thick white clouds that hung in the air too long. But Pete, it is July. There is no snow. The roads are clear. Not for her. For her. It is always winter. Always that night she died. Mark started his engine. The diesel turned over reluctantly, like it was fighting through ice. He needed to get moving. Get away from mile marker 37. But his headlights picked up something that made his heart stop. Footprints in the snow. Except there was no snow. Just hot asphalt gleaming under the summer stars. But the footprints were there. Bare feet walking away from his truck toward the tree line. Small feet. A woman's feet. Following a trail that led into the Alaska wilderness where no roads existed. Mark grabbed his flashlight and climbed down from the cab. The air hit him like a slap. Summer air that somehow burned his lungs with cold. The beam of his flashlight showed the impossible. Snow. Everywhere. The highway was buried under 3 feet of fresh powder. His truck sat in a drift that should have made driving impossible. But he had been driving on clear pavement just moments before. The footprints led into the forest. Small. Desperate. Like someone running from something worse than death. Mark followed them. The trees closed around him like a tomb. Every step took him deeper into a winter that existed only for him. Only for anyone foolish enough to pick up Sarah Mitchell on her endless journey home. He found her at the bottom of a ravine. The car was a blue sedan from the 80s. Crushed against a pine tree. Its windshield starred with impact. Inside, he could see her. The real Sarah Mitchell. Still 22. Still wearing her summer dress. Still trying to crawl toward the road. Still dying. Over and over again, she looked up at him with eyes like frozen lakes. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Just the whisper of wind through dead branches. Mark understood. She was not evil, not malicious, just lost, trapped in the moment of her death, playing it out for anyone who would listen. Anyone who would stop and help. But helping meant joining her. Mark backed away from the ravine. The snow was getting deeper. His flashlight was dimming. Soon he would be as lost as Sarah, as cold as Sarah, as dead as Sarah. He ran. Behind him, he could hear her following. Not footsteps in the snow. Something worse. The sound of someone crawling through ice and broken glass. Someone who would never give up. Someone who just wanted to go home. Mark reached his truck and gunned the engine. The tires spun on summer asphalt that his eyes still saw as snow. He did not look in his mirrors. Did not check his passenger seat. He drove straight through to Whitehorse without stopping. The next morning, he filed a report with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Hallucinations from carbon monoxide poisoning. Faulty heater. Standard explanation for things that could not be explained. They found nothing at mile marker 37. No car, no body, no evidence that Sarah Mitchell had ever existed. But the ice on Mark, this passenger seat, took 3 days to melt. And when it finally thawed, it left something behind. A summer dress, size 6, still damp with melted snow. Mark quit driving the Alaska Highway after that. Took routes through the lower 48 where the summer stayed warm and the dead stayed buried. But sometimes, late at night when he is driving through places where cell towers do not reach, his CB radio picks up transmissions from the highway. Truckers reporting a woman in a summer dress. Cold as winter, real as frostbite, still trying to get home. Mark always changes the channel when he hears those calls. But he never forgets the sound of her voice. Asking for help. Asking for a ride, just like she asked him. Story 3. Ice cave that whispers your name. Jake, his headlamp died in the deepest part of the Mendenhall ice cave, leaving him in darkness so complete it felt solid. He fumbled for his backup light, hands shaking from cold and something deeper than cold. Something that had been growing in his chest since he first heard his own voice echoing from the depths of the glacier. The backup light flickered to life, casting wild shadows on walls of blue ice that seemed to pulse like a living heart. Jake had been exploring caves for 15 years, from Kentucky, its limestone caverns, to New Mexico, its lava tubes. But this was different. This was wrong. The ice here was older than civilization, older than humanity itself, and it was listening. He'd come to Alaska to document the Mendenhall Glacier, its ice caves before climate change melted them forever. National Geographic assignment. Good money. Should have been routine. But the moment he stepped into the first chamber, Jake had felt eyes watching him from within the walls. Now, 3 hours deep in the glacier, his belly, he knew those eyes belonged to something that shouldn't exist. The whispers started again, soft at first, like wind through frozen cracks. Then louder, clearer, his own voice, speaking words he never said. Turn back, Jake. There's nothing here for you. Nothing but ice and death. But it wasn't quite his voice. The tone was right, the accent perfect, but there was something underneath it. Something hungry, something that had been waiting in the ice for centuries. Jake pressed forward, his boots crunching on snow that had never seen sunlight. The cave narrowed ahead, forcing him to crawl through a tunnel barely wide enough for his shoulders. Ice pressed against him from all sides, so cold it burned through his insulated gear. On the other side of the tunnel, the cave opened into a vast chamber that shouldn't have existed. Jake, his headlamp beam, disappeared into blackness above, unable to find the ceiling. The walls were covered in patterns that looked almost like writing, carved deep into the ancient ice. But as Jake moved closer, he realized they weren't carvings. They were shapes pressed into the ice from the inside. Human shapes, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. People trapped in the glacier, their bodies perfectly preserved in the eternal cold. Some looked like they'd been frozen yesterday. Others wore clothes from decades past. A few were dressed in animal skins that belonged to no historical period Jake recognized. All of them had their mouths open, as if they'd been screaming when the ice claimed them. Jake pulled out his camera with numb fingers. This was the discovery of a lifetime. Evidence of people living in Alaska far earlier than any archaeological record suggested. The photos would make his career. But when he looked through the viewfinder, he saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. One of the figures in the ice was wearing his exact clothes. His jacket, his boots, his face. Jake lowered the camera and looked directly at the wall. The figure was gone. Just smooth ice where he'd seen his own frozen corpse moments before. He raised the camera again. There it was, his own body, mouth open in a silent scream, eyes wide with terror. Fresh ice crystals covered his hair like he'd been frozen within the last few minutes. Jake backed away from the wall, his breath coming in sharp puffs that hung in the air too long. The whispers were getting louder now, coming from all directions. Dozens of voices, all speaking in perfect unison. You shouldn't have come here, Jake. This place is older than your kind, older than your nightmares. It remembers when the world was different, when things that lived in ice ruled the frozen places. The voices weren't just his anymore. Jake recognized others. His brother Mike, who died in Afghanistan 5 years ago. His college girlfriend Sarah, who married someone else and moved to California. His mother, still alive but thousands of miles away in Ohio. All of them speaking from within the ice. All of them warning him to leave. But when Jake turned to go back the way he came, the tunnel was gone. Smooth wall stretched where the opening had been just moments before. No sign that a passage had ever existed. He was trapped in a chamber full of frozen corpses, listening to the voices of everyone he ever cared about echoing from walls of ancient ice. Jake ran his hands over the wall, searching for any crack or seam that might indicate a hidden exit. The ice was smooth as glass and twice as hard. When he pressed his ear against it, he could hear something moving deep inside the glacier. Something large, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. The whispers stopped suddenly, leaving Jake in silence so complete it hurt his ears. Then, from somewhere far below, came a sound like breaking glass mixed with a wail, a song. Deep, haunting, alive. Something in the glacier was waking up. Jake pulled out his satellite phone, praying for a signal this deep underground. The screen showed no bars, but he tried calling anyway. The phone crackled with static, then went dead. When he looked at the screen again, it showed a message that made his hands shake. Call failed. Subscriber does not exist. Jake checked his contact list. Every number was gone, every name erased. According to his phone, he had no family, no friends, no connections to the outside world. The device insisted he didn't exist. He checked his wallet with growing panic. His driver's license was blank where his photo should have been. His credit card showed no name. Even his press credentials from National Geographic were empty plastic rectangles. The ice wasn't just trapping him. It was erasing him, removing all evidence that Jake Morrison had ever existed. The sound from below came again, closer this time. Jake realized it wasn't one massive creature, but hundreds of smaller ones. Things that lived in the spaces between ice crystals, feeding on cold and darkness and the terror of lost travelers. They were climbing toward him. Jake pressed himself against the wall of frozen corpses, his headlamp beam dancing wildly as his hands shook. The light caught something that made him scream. The figures in the ice were moving. Not much, just slight shifts in position. A hand that had been pressed against the wall now pointed downward. A face that had been looking straight ahead now stared directly at Jake. They were trying to tell him something. Jake followed the pointing fingers and staring eyes to a section of floor he hadn't noticed before. The ice there was different. Newer, less solid. When he knelt and pressed his palm against it, he could feel air moving underneath. A way out, but not up toward the surface. Down, deeper into the glacier. His heart. The sounds from below were getting louder. Jake could hear scraping now, like claws on ice. The creatures that lived in the glacier. Its depths were almost here. He had maybe minutes before they reached this chamber. Jake pulled out his ice axe and began chopping at the thin ice. Each blow sent shockwaves through the chamber, causing the frozen figures to shift more noticeably. They were all pointing now, all staring at the same spot where Jake worked frantically to break through. The ice gave way suddenly, revealing a vertical shaft that disappeared into blackness. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying with it the smell of something ancient and wrong. Like meat that had been frozen for geological ages, Jake could hear the scraping sounds right outside the chamber now. Whatever lived down there was almost here. He had seconds to make a choice. Stay and face the creatures of the deep ice, or jump into an unknown shaft that might lead anywhere. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't warnings. They were encouragement, his own voice, speaking from within the walls. Jump, Jake. It's the only way. Trust the ice. Trust the cold. Let it take you where you need to go. Jake looked one more time at his frozen reflection in the ice wall. The figure was different now. Instead of screaming, it was smiling. Its eyes held knowledge instead of terror. The scraping sounds reached the chamber entrance. Jake saw the first of the ice creatures emerge from cracks in the wall. Things that looked like they'd been carved from frozen shadow, with too many teeth and eyes that glowed like pale stars. Jake jumped. The shaft swallowed him completely. He fell through darkness, his headlamp beam showing walls of ice rushing past at impossible speed. But he wasn't accelerating. If anything, he was slowing down, as if the air itself was getting thicker. He landed softly on a floor of snow that felt warm against his skin. Jake stood up, surprised to find himself unhurt. The shaft above had closed, sealing him in another chamber, but this one was different from the last. The walls here were covered with paintings instead of frozen corpses. Cave art that depicted scenes from Alaska. It was prehistory. Mammoths and saber-toothed cats and early humans hunting across landscapes that no longer existed. But mixed in with the ancient art were newer images. Planes crashing into mountainsides, ships sinking in frozen seas, hikers lost in blizzards, all the ways that Alaska had been claiming lives for the past century. And at the center of it all, a figure that Jake recognized with growing horror. It was him, but not him as he was now. This version of Jake was older, weathered. His eyes held the same knowledge that Jake had seen in his frozen reflection above. This Jake was holding a paintbrush, adding new images to the wall. Recent additions that showed contemporary scenes. A search and rescue helicopter circling the Mendenhall Glacier. News reporters covering the story of a missing photographer. His own funeral, attended by people Jake didn't recognize because the ice had already begun erasing his connections to the living world. Future Jake looked up from his painting and smiled. "Welcome home," he said, and his voice echoed with the same hungry undertone Jake had heard in the whispers above. "I've been waiting for you to catch up." Jake tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The chamber was sealed, with no exits he could see. Future Jake continued painting, adding details to the funeral scene with careful precision. "The ice doesn't trap people," Future Jake explained without looking away from his work. "It offers them a choice. Stay connected to a world that is dying, or become part of something eternal. Something that remembers." Jake felt his own memories beginning to fade. His childhood in Ohio was getting fuzzy. His college years felt like someone else's experiences. Even his assignment from National Geographic seemed distant and unimportant. The only thing that felt real was this chamber, this moment, this conversation with a version of himself that had already made the choice. "How long have you been here?" Jake asked. Future Jake considered the question. "Time moves differently in the deep ice. I've painted 1,000 sunrises that I'll never see. Documented 1,000,000 moments that happened in the world above. The ice shows me everything. Past, present, future. All of it happening at once in the eternal cold." Jake looked more closely at the paintings on the walls. They weren't just scenes from Alaska's history. They were prophecies, images of events that hadn't happened yet. Cities swallowed by rising seas. Forests burning under alien skies. The last human settlements clinging to existence in a world transformed by climate change. "You documenting the end of the world," Jake whispered. "I am documenting the transition," Future Jake corrected. "The world isn't ending. It is changing, becoming something new, something that the ice has seen before, in cycles that repeat every few million years. Humanity is just the current chapter." Jake felt his phone buzz in his pocket. Impossible, since there was no signal down here and the device had been dead for hours. But when he pulled it out, the screen showed a text message from his own number. "Stop fighting it. The ice wants to preserve you, make you part of the eternal record. You came here to document the glacier before it melted. Now you can document everything. Forever." Jake looked around the chamber one more time. The paintings seemed to be moving now, showing him scenes that shifted and changed like living memories. He could see his own life playing out in perfect detail. Every moment, every choice, every person he ever met. And he could see beyond his life, into futures that branched out like infinite possibilities. Versions of himself that had never come to Alaska. Versions that had died in childhood accidents. Versions that had lived to old age in worlds that no longer existed. All of them were here in the ice. All of them were him. Future Jake finished the funeral painting and turned to face his younger self. The choice is simple. Fight the ice and become another frozen corpse in the wall above. Or accept it and become something more, a keeper of memories, a witness to everything that was, is, and will be. Jake felt the last of his connections to the outside world dissolving. His memories of home were like snowflakes melting on warm skin. His plans for the future seemed as distant as childhood dreams. But there was something seductive about the ice's offer. To see everything, to know everything, to be part of a consciousness that spanned geological ages and witness the rise and fall of entire species. Jake picked up a paintbrush from the floor beside future Jake's feet. It felt warm in his hands, despite the freezing temperature of the chamber. When he dipped it in paint that seemed to appear from nowhere, the brush came away loaded with colors that didn't exist in nature. He approached the wall and began to paint. Not scenes from his memory, but visions that came to him from the ice itself. Images of what was happening in the world above at this very moment. His search team, giving up after 3 days of looking. His editor at National Geographic, assigning the story to someone else. His apartment in Denver, where his mail was piling up and his plants were dying from neglect. None of it mattered anymore. Jake was part of something larger now. Something that would outlast human civilization and remember it long after the last cities had crumbled to dust. He painted through what might have been days or years or centuries. Time had no meaning in the deep ice. Jake added image after image to the chamber walls, documenting a world that continued to change above while he remained constant below. Sometimes, he could hear the whispers of other people entering the glacier. Explorers and tourists and researchers drawn by the same mysterious pull that had brought Jake to this place. The ice would call to them in their own voices, showing them visions of themselves that they couldn't resist investigating. And eventually, they would find their way down here, to the chamber where Jake waited with paintbrushes and infinite patience, ready to welcome them to the eternal cold. The ice cave that whispered your name never let anyone leave unchanged. It collected people the way libraries collected books, preserving them forever in its endless halls of frozen memory. Jake smiled as he heard familiar footsteps echoing through the passages above. Another explorer had entered the glacier, drawn by whispers of their own voice calling from the depths. Soon, Jake would have company again. The ice was always hungry for new stories to preserve. Story 4. Frozen Screams of Alaska. As Dyatlov passed Sarah, its breath came in sharp bursts as she stared at the photograph. The image showed 5 bodies, half buried in Alaskan ice. Their eyes were wide open, their mouths frozen mid-scream. She had been researching missing persons cases for her true crime podcast when she stumbled across this file. Buried deep in the National Park Service archives. Marked classified until 2028. The date stamp read March 15, 1978. The Brooks Range, Alaska's version of the Dyatlov Pass incident. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through the digital files. 5 hikers from Colorado, experienced outdoorsmen. They had vanished during what should have been a routine winter expedition. The rescue report made her stomach turn. Bodies found in unnatural positions. No signs of struggle. No evidence of an avalanche or animal attack. The temperature had been minus 40 degrees when they disappeared, but the bodies showed no signs of hypothermia. Instead, they looked like they had been running from something. Running and screaming. Sarah clicked on the final document. A journal entry. The last one written by expedition leader Marcus Chen. Day 7. Something is wrong here. The cold doesn't affect it. Whatever is following us, it doesn't freeze. It doesn't even leave tracks in the snow. But we can hear it breathing at night. Heavy, deliberate, like it's tasting the air. Johnson swears he saw eyes in the tree line yesterday. Yellow eyes. Too big to be human. Too intelligent to be animal. We tried to radio for help, but all we get is static. And sometimes, if we listen close enough, we can hear something breathing through the radio too. The others want to keep moving, but I think it wants us to keep moving. I think it is hurting us somewhere. God help us. It doesn't freeze. It watches. Sarah leaned back in her chair. Her coffee had gone cold while she read. She lived in Fairbanks, born and raised. She knew the Brooks Range like most people knew their neighborhood streets. Her grandfather had been a bush pilot. He had told her stories about that place. Strange stories, but this was different. This was documented, official. She grabbed her phone and called her research assistant. Tommy, I need you to book me a flight to Coldfoot, she said. And rent me a snow machine. Sarah, it is February. In Alaska. Are you insane? Probably. But I think I found our next story. 3 days later, Sarah was standing in the exact spot where the bodies had been found. She had used GPS coordinates from the case file. The location was remote, 30 miles from the nearest road. The wind howled through the mountains like a living thing. She set up her recording equipment. The isolation microphone would pick up every sound, every whisper of wind, every crack of ice. This is Sarah Martinez with Northern Mysteries. She spoke into her microphone. I am standing in one of the most remote locations in North America. The Brooks Range, where 5 experienced hikers met their end in 1978. She paused. Something felt wrong. The wind had stopped. In Alaska, in February, the wind never stopped. But now the air was perfectly still, like the entire mountain was holding its breath. Sarah continued recording. She walked through the timeline, the hikers' route, their final camp, the discovery of the bodies. As she spoke, she noticed something odd. Her voice was echoing differently, like the sound was bouncing off something massive, something close. She looked around. Nothing but snow and rock formations. She kept recording for 20 minutes. Professional, thorough, but the whole time, she felt watched. When she finished, she packed her equipment quickly. The sun was setting. In the Arctic winter, darkness came fast and stayed long. She started her snow machine. The engine roared to life. But as she began to drive away, she heard something else. Breathing, heavy, deliberate, just like Marcus Chen had described. Sarah gunned the engine. The snow machine shot forward across the frozen landscape. Behind her, she could hear something moving, something big, keeping pace with her machine. She didn't look back. The ride to Coldfoot took 2 hours. By the time she reached the small settlement, her hands were shaking. Not from cold, from adrenaline. She checked into the motel and immediately began reviewing her recordings. What she heard made her blood freeze. At the 18-minute mark, there was a sound in the background. Barely audible, but unmistakable. Breathing. And at 22 minutes, just before she had packed up her equipment, there was something else. A voice, whispering. She enhanced the audio, isolated the frequencies, cleaned up the background noise. The voice was saying her name, Sarah, over and over again. She slammed her laptop shut. Her heart was pounding. She called Tommy. I need you to research something for me, she said. Look up indigenous legends from the Brooks Range. Specifically, anything about creatures that hunt in winter. Sarah, you sound scared. What happened up there? Just do it, please. An hour later, Tommy called back. I found something. The Inupiat people have stories about the Tornarsik, winter spirits that hunt humans. They're supposed to be shapeshifters. They can mimic voices, and they never feel cold. What else? There's something weird, Sarah. I found a newspaper article from 1952. A trapper named William Hayes reported being stalked by something in the same area. He said it followed him for days. Breathing, watching. He made it out alive. But he was changed. The article says he never spoke above a whisper again. Like he was afraid of being too loud. Sarah felt ice in her veins. Tommy, I need you to book me another flight. Tonight. Where? Home. Now. But as she hung up the phone, she realized something terrible. The breathing sound was still there. She could hear it through the thin walls of the motel room. Heavy, deliberate. Right outside her door, Sarah grabbed her backpack. She moved to the window. The parking lot was empty except for her rental car. But there were tracks in the snow. Large tracks, leading from the tree line to her door. And the tracks didn't look human. They looked like something walking on 2 legs. But the spacing was wrong. Too long, like whatever made them had joints in different places. She climbed out the window. The cold hit her like a physical force. Minus 30 degrees. She ran to her car, started the engine. The headlights illuminated the parking lot. There was something standing by the trees. Tall, too tall, with yellow eyes that reflected the light like mirrors. It wasn't moving, just watching. Sarah threw the car in reverse, floored it. The rental car fishtail ed on the icy road. But she kept driving. She didn't stop until she reached Fairbanks Airport. The next morning, she was back in her studio. Safe, warm, surrounded by familiar things. She tried to edit the recording from the Brooks Range. But every time she played it back, there were new sounds. Sounds that hadn't been there before. Footsteps, getting closer, breathing, getting heavier, and always, that voice whispering her name. She deleted the files, all of them. But that night, lying in her own bed, in her own house, she heard it again. The breathing, heavy, deliberate, right outside her bedroom window. She looked through the curtains. Nothing there, just her neighbor's house, the street lamp, normal suburban life. But in the morning, there were tracks in her yard. Large tracks, leading from the street to her window. The same tracks she had seen at the motel. Sarah called in sick to work. She boarded up her windows. She bought motion sensor lights, security cameras. She did everything she could think of. But every night, the breathing returned. And every morning, new tracks appeared. She researched the Tornarsik legends more deeply. According to Inupiat tradition, once the winter spirits marked you, They never stopped hunting. They followed their prey across any distance. Through any weather, they were patient, they were persistent, and they were always hungry. Sarah tried moving to her sister's house in Anchorage. The breathing followed her there too. She tried staying in hotels, motels, friends, apartments. The breathing was always there. Just outside, waiting, she stopped sleeping, started drinking coffee by the pot. Her hands developed a permanent shake. Tommy was worried about her. He kept asking what had happened in the Brooks Range. But how could she explain? How could she tell him that something impossible was stalking her? Something that shouldn't exist. 2 weeks after her trip, Sarah was editing a different story when she heard a knock at her studio door. She looked through the security monitor. No one there, but the knocking continued, deliberate, patient. She called the police. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No footprints. Nothing. But Sarah knew the truth. It was getting bolder. That night, she decided to face it. She loaded her grandfather's hunting rifle. She put on her warmest clothes. She went outside. I know you were there, she called into the darkness. What do you want? The breathing stopped. For the first time in 2 weeks, there was complete silence. Then she heard her own voice coming from the trees. I know you were there. What do you want? Perfect mimicry. Her exact tone. Her exact inflection. I know you were there. What do you want? Over and over again, coming from different directions now, like there were multiple copies of her surrounding the house. Sarah ran inside, slammed the door, threw the deadbolt, but she could still hear her own voice outside. I know you were there. What do you want? Growing louder, more insistent. She called Tommy. You need to help me, she whispered into the phone. Sarah, it is 3 a.m. Are you okay? Listen to me carefully. Something followed me back from the Brooks Range. Something that shouldn't exist. Sarah, you were scaring me. I need you to research something else. Look up cases of people who encountered these things. Find out how they stopped them. Sarah, please, just do it. Tommy called back an hour later. I found something, but you were not going to like it. Tell me, according to the legends, the Tornarsik only stop hunting for 2 reasons. Either their prey dies, or their prey goes back to where the encounter started. Goes back to make an offering, to appease them. What kind of offering? Tommy was quiet for a long moment. The legend's errand, to clear. But Sarah, you'd be thinking of going back there. Not alone, not in winter, but Sarah was already making plans. She knew she couldn't live like this, constantly afraid, always looking over her shoulder. The thing outside her house was getting more aggressive every night. Last night, it had tried the doorknob. She packed her equipment, her grandfather's rifle, emergency supplies. She drove back to Coldfoot, the same motel, the same room. This time, she didn't try to hide. I am here, she called out as she walked to the spot where the hikers had died. You wanted me back. Here I am. The response was immediate. The temperature dropped. The wind died. The oppressive silence returned. But now she could see it. Standing 30 feet away. Tall as a basketball player, but wrong somehow. Proportions that didn't make sense. Arms too long. Fingers too thin. Its face was the worst part. It had her face, perfect in every detail. But the eyes were yellow. Animal eyes. Predator eyes. What do you want? Sarah asked. The thing with her face smiled. To understand, it said in her voice. Understand what? Fear. Your kind produces such interesting fear. So complex. So layered. Sarah raised her rifle. The hikers in 1978. You killed them. No, they fed me. There is a difference. Fed you what? Their terror. Their final moments. The purest emotion your species produces. Sarah's finger found the trigger. And now you want mine. I already have it. You have been feeding me for weeks. Every sleepless night. Every racing heartbeat. Every look over your shoulder. The creature stepped closer. But I want more than fear now. I want to understand how you create such beautiful terror. I want to learn your methods. Sarah realized with growing horror what it meant. My podcast. My research. You want to learn how to hunt people better. Humans are so much more afraid when they think they understand what hunts them. Your stories make the fear deeper. Richer. Another step closer. Teach me. Sarah pulled the trigger. The bullet passed through the creature like it was made of mist. It laughed. Her laugh. But wrong. Iron cannot harm shadow. Fire cannot burn ice. You cannot kill winter itself. Sarah ran. Back to her snow machine. Back toward Coldfoot. But as she drove, she heard her own voice calling from the darkness. Teach me, Sarah. Teach me how to make them afraid. She made it to the motel. Barricaded herself in her room. She called Tommy. It was not trying to kill me, she whispered. It wants me to help it hunt other people. Sarah, get out of there. Come home. I can... Dom? Do you understand? If I leave, it follows me. If I stay, it learns from me. Either way, other people die. She hung up the phone. There was only one choice left. Sarah opened her laptop, started a new recording. This is Sarah Martinez with Northern Mysteries. If you re-listening to this, I'm probably dead. But you need to know what is out there in the Brooks Range, in the winter darkness. She told the whole story, everything that had happened, everything she had learned. As she spoke, she could hear the breathing outside her door getting heavier. More excited. It was listening, learning. The Tornarsic feeds on fear, she continued. But it is evolving, adapting. It doesn't just want to kill anymore. It wants to understand us, our methods, our stories. The door handle turned. If you encounter one of these things, Dawn, to try to fight it. Dawn, to try to run. And whatever you do, Dawn, to try to communicate with it. The door opened. The creature stepped inside, still wearing her face, still smiling, because the moment you acknowledge it exists, the moment you show it fear, you become its teacher. Sarah looked directly at the thing, and some lessons should never be learned. She ended the recording, uploaded it to her cloud storage, set it to publish automatically. Then she deleted her research files, her notes, everything she had learned about hunting humans through fear. The creature watched her with yellow eyes. What are you doing? Making sure you stay hungry, Sarah said. She picked up her grandfather's rifle, not to shoot the creature. It was already proven that wouldn't work. Instead, she turned the barrel toward herself. Wait, the creature said. You haven't taught me yet. Sarah smiled. I just did. The most important lesson of all. The creature, his face contorted with confusion. Some prey won, to be taken. Some fears can, to be harvested. And some hunters starve because they never learned when to stop. She pulled the trigger. The creature screamed, a sound like winter wind through broken glass. Without Sarah, this fear to feed on, without her knowledge to learn from, it began to fade. Not dying, these things didn't die, but returning to the shadows, back to the patient hunting of animals, back to simple predation instead of complex psychological warfare. Tommy found the recording 3 days later, along with Sarah's body in a motel room in Coldfoot. The official report listed it as suicide, depression brought on by isolation and the stress of her research. But Tommy knew better. He published the recording as she had intended. As a warning, most people dismissed it as fiction, an elaborate horror story for her podcast. But deep in the comment section, buried among the skeptics and thrill seekers, there were other messages. From people who had heard breathing outside their windows, from hikers who had seen yellow eyes in the forest, from researchers who had gone too deep into the darkness and brought something back with them. The Tornarsic were still out there, still hunting, but now they knew that some humans would fight back. Some would choose death over teaching monsters how to kill. And in the frozen wilderness of Alaska, where winter lasts 8 months and the sun barely rises, that knowledge had made them more careful, more patient, more hungry. Late at night, when the aurora borealis dances across the sky like spirits made of light, you can still hear them in the wind. Breathing, waiting, learning. Story 5. Thing that stalks Alaska's gas stations. Jake was watching the security monitor when the thing appeared again. 3 in the morning, same as always, standing just outside the reach of the parking lot lights at Miller's Stop, the loneliest gas station on the Alaska highway. The figure never moved, never bought anything, just stood there, staring. Jake had been working the night shift for 6 months. He thought he had seen everything the Alaskan wilderness could throw at a gas station clerk. Drunk truckers, lost tourists, bears looking for garbage, but this was different. The thing looked human from a distance, about 6 feet tall, wearing what appeared to be a dark coat. But something was wrong with the way it stood. Too still, like a mannequin someone had left in the parking lot. Jake squinted at the monitor. The security camera was old. The image was grainy, but he could make out enough to know that whatever was standing out there had been coming around for weeks. Always at 3 in the morning, always in the same spot, always staring directly at the store. He grabbed his flashlight and walked to the front windows. The fluorescent lights inside made it hard to see out into the darkness. But he could make out a shape in the distance, motionless, waiting. Jake had tried approaching it before, twice. Both times, by the time he made it outside, the thing was gone. No footprints in the snow. No sign it had ever been there. But it always came back. Tonight felt different though. Tonight, Jake had decided he was going to get answers. He pulled out his phone and opened the voice recorder app. He was documenting everything now. His girlfriend Emma thought he was losing his mind. His boss thought he was making excuses to avoid work. But Jake knew what he was seeing. Something was hunting the night shift workers along this stretch of highway. And he was going to prove it. Jake spoke into his phone as he watched the security monitor. His voice was steady, professional, like he was narrating a nature documentary. The figure on the camera shifted slightly. For the first time in months of watching, it moved. It turned its head toward the store, toward the camera. Jake felt his blood freeze. The thing was looking directly at him, through the monitor, like it knew he was watching. But that was impossible. The security camera was hidden in the eaves of the building. There was no way anyone outside could see it. No way they could know which direction it was pointing, unless they had been watching the store for a very long time. Learning its layout, studying its weaknesses, Jake zoomed in on the monitor. The image pixelated and blurred. But for just a moment, he caught a glimpse of the thing, his face. It was human, mostly, but the proportions were wrong. The eyes were too large, too reflective, like an animal caught in headlights. And it was smiling. Jake stumbled backward from the monitor. His phone clattered to the floor. The voice recorder kept running, capturing his rapid breathing and the hum of the store, its refrigeration units. When he looked back at the screen, the thing was gone. Jake ran outside. The parking lot was empty. Nothing but tire tracks from the day shift and his own footprints from when he had arrived for work. But there was something new. A single set of tracks leading from the spot where the thing had been standing. The prints were human-shaped but wrong somehow. Too long, too narrow, like someone wearing shoes that didn't fit properly. The tracks led away from the store, into the forest, into the darkness. Jake followed them with his flashlight. The beam cut through the night, illuminating snow-covered trees and patches of ice. The tracks were easy to follow at first, clear impressions in the fresh snow. But after 50 yards, they simply stopped. Not like the thing had turned around or jumped to another surface. The tracks just ended, like whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. Jake stood in the forest, surrounded by silence. No wind, no animal sounds, even the distant hum of traffic from the highway had faded. He was completely alone, or so he thought. The breathing started behind him. Slow, deliberate, like something large trying to stay quiet. Jake spun around. His flashlight swept across the trees. Nothing there, but the breathing continued, getting closer. He ran, back toward the store, back toward the lights and the warmth and the illusion of safety. His phone was still on the floor where he had dropped it. Still recording. Jake played back the audio. His own voice. The sound of him dropping the phone. His footsteps as he ran outside. And then, clear as day, something else. Footsteps following him, matching his pace, staying just far enough behind to remain hidden. The recording captured something else too. Right before Jake had run back inside, there was a sound. Barely audible. Laughter. Low. Amused. Like whatever was out there found his fear entertaining. Jake called his boss. Pete Miller had owned the gas station for 30 years. If anyone knew about strange happenings along this stretch of highway, it would be him. Pete answered on the fourth ring, groggy and irritated. Jake, it is 3:30 in the morning. What's wrong? Pete, I need to ask you something. Have other night shift workers reported anything unusual? Anyone watching the store? There was a long pause. Jake, are you drinking on the job? No, sir, I am serious. There is something out here. Something that's been coming around for months. Another pause. Longer this time. Jake, you're not the first person to ask me that question. Pete, his voice was different now. Quieter, more serious. What do you mean? 3 years ago, I had a night clerk named Danny. Good kid, reliable. He started calling me with stories about someone watching the store. Someone who never came inside. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan cold. What happened to Danny? He quit, said he couldn't take it anymore. But before he left, he told me something interesting. He said he had figured out what the thing wanted. What? It wasn't hunting people, Jake. It was studying them, learning their routines, their habits, their fears. Jake looked at the security monitor. The parking lot was still empty. But he had the uncomfortable feeling that empty didn't mean alone. Pete, where is Danny now? The line went quiet. Pete? Danny disappeared 6 months after he quit. They found his car on the side of the highway. Engine running, door open. No sign of struggle. No sign of Danny. Jake felt his hands start to shake. The thing is back? ISN? Pete asked. Yes. Jake, listen to me very carefully. Do not try to confront it. Do not try to follow it. And whatever you do, do not let it know that you redocumenting its behavior. Why? Because Danny made that mistake. He started taking pictures, recording videos, trying to prove it existed. Pete's voice dropped to a whisper. The night before he disappeared, Danny called me. He said he had finally captured clear footage of the thing, his face. He was going to post it online, show the world what was stalking gas station workers in Alaska. Did he? The video never made it online. And Danny never made it home. Jake hung up the phone. His hands were trembling now, not just from fear, but from realization. He had been doing exactly what Danny had done. Recording, documenting, trying to prove the thing existed. And now it knew. Jake looked at his phone. The voice recorder was still running. It had been recording for over an hour. He was about to stop the app when he heard something that made his blood turn to ice. His own voice, playing through the phone, his speaker. But he wasn't talking. The voice was coming from outside, from the parking lot, like something out there was playing back his recordings. Jake crept to the window. In the distance, barely visible in the darkness, he could see a figure standing in the same spot as before. But now it was holding something that glowed softly in the night. A phone. Jake's phone. But that was impossible. His phone was right here in his hand. Unless the thing had somehow copied it. Somehow duplicated not just the device, but the recordings on it. The figure in the parking lot raised the glowing object to its face. Jake's own voice drifted across the empty space between them. Pete, I need to ask you something. Have other night shift workers reported anything unusual? The thing was playing back his conversation with Pete. Word for word, perfect mimicry. But why? Jake watched in horror as the figure began to move. It walked toward the store. Slowly, deliberately, still playing back the recording. As it got closer, Jake could see it more clearly. It was wearing his clothes, his jacket, his work uniform, and its face. Its face was his face. Perfect in every detail. But the eyes were wrong. Too bright, too knowing. The thing that looked like Jake approached the front door of the store. It reached into its pocket and pulled out a set of keys. Keys identical to the ones in Jake's pocket. Jake ran to the back office. He locked the door behind him. But he knew it wouldn't matter. If the thing outside could copy phones and keys, a locked door wouldn't stop it. He called Pete again. It's here, he whispered into the phone. It's wearing my face. Jake, get out of there. Now, I can. It's between me and the exit. Jake could hear the front door opening, the electronic chime that signaled a customer had entered. But there was no customer, just the thing that looked like him. Footsteps in the store, moving through the aisles, methodical, searching. Jake held his breath, tried to make no sound. The footsteps stopped outside the office door. A knock, 3 soft taps, then Jake, his own voice, muffled by the door. Jake, are you in there? It's me. Perfect mimicry. His own voice, his own inflection. I know you. Scared, Jake. But you don't. Do you have to be? I just want to talk. Jake pressed himself against the far wall, as far from the door as possible. I've been watching you for months, Jake. Learning from you. You were so much more interesting than the others. The door handle turned. Danny was boring, predictable. But you were different. You document things. You ask questions. You think. The door opened slowly. The thing that looked like Jake stood in the doorway, smiling with Jake's face. I need someone like you, Jake. Someone who can help me understand how humans work. How they think. How they fear. It stepped into the office. You see, I've been doing this for a very long time. Watching, learning, but I've only been copying the outside. The appearance, the mannerisms. Another step closer. I want to understand what's inside. The thoughts, the memories, the dreams. Jake pressed himself against the wall. There was nowhere left to run. What are you? The thing tilted its head. Jake, its gesture, but wrong somehow. What happens when the wilderness gets lonely? Jake. When the darkness between towns gets tired of being empty. It reached out with Jake's hand. And what fills the spaces where people fear to look? Jake closed his eyes, waited for whatever was coming. But instead of pain, he felt nothing. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in the parking lot. Looking at the store. Through the windows, he could see himself inside, working the night shift, stocking shelves, operating the register. But it wasn't to him. It was the thing, wearing his life like a costume. Jake tried to scream. No sound came out. He tried to run. His legs wouldn't move. He tried to think, but his thoughts felt sluggish, distant, like they were happening to someone else. The thing inside the store looked up, made eye contact with Jake through the window. It smiled with his face, waved with his hand. Then it went back to work, playing the role of Jake the night clerk, living his life, stealing his identity. Jake understood now. This was what had happened to Danny. This was what happened to all of them. The thing didn't kill people. It replaced them. It studied them until it could become them. Perfectly. Completely. And then it sent the original somewhere else. Somewhere outside. Somewhere they could only watch their life being lived by something that wasn't to them. Jake tried to move again. This time, his legs responded. But he wasn't controlling them. He was walking. Away from the store. Away from the lights. Into the forest. Into the darkness. His body moved without his permission. His thoughts became quieter. More distant. He was fading. Becoming less real. Less present. As he walked deeper into the woods, he passed other figures. Standing motionless among the trees. Danny was there. The night clerk from 3 years ago. Still wearing his work uniform. Still young. Still frozen in the moment he had been replaced. There were others too. Men and women Jake didn't recognize. All wearing the clothes they had died in. All standing perfectly still. All staring back toward the lights of civilization they would never reach again. Jake took his place among them. Another silent sentinel in the forest. Another displaced soul watching his life being lived by something else. The thing in the store continued working. It served the occasional customer, restocked the shelves, played the role of Jake so perfectly that no one suspected anything was wrong. When Emma called to check on him, it answered in his voice. Said all the right things. Made all the right jokes. When Pete stopped by to check on the night shift, it greeted him with Jake, his smile. Discussed the weather with Jake, his mannerisms. Days turned to weeks. The thing learned more about being Jake. It read his texts, studied his photos, absorbed his memories like a sponge. It got better at being him. More convincing, more complete. And in the forest, Jake watched his life being stolen. Piece by piece, memory by memory. He wanted to scream, to warn people, to somehow communicate that the thing behind the counter wasn't to him. But he had no voice, no agency, no power. He was just another observer now. Another witness to the thing, his perfect impersonation. Months passed. The thing that looked like Jake was promoted to assistant manager. It moved into Jake's apartment. It dated Jake's girlfriend. It lived Jake's life better than Jake ever had. And still Jake watched from the forest, surrounded by the others who had been replaced. A growing audience of displaced souls. The thing was getting confident now, comfortable. It had mastered being human. At least, it had mastered being this particular human. But Jake could see something else happening. The thing was getting bored. It would stand at the store windows sometimes, looking out into the darkness. Searching. It was hunting again, looking for the next person to study, the next life to steal, the next identity to perfect. Jake tried to warn the new night clerk when he started. A young man named Tyler. Eager, hardworking, exactly the type of person the thing preferred. But Jake had no voice. No way to communicate. He could only watch as the thing began its patient observation, its careful study. Tyler started asking the same questions Jake had asked. Noticing the figure that stood in the parking lot at 3 in the morning. Trying to document its behavior. The cycle was beginning again. And Jake realized something horrible. He wasn't the first Jake. The thing had been doing this for decades. Maybe centuries. Replacing people one by one. Building a collection of stolen lives. Each person it replaced joined the silent audience in the forest. Each new identity made it more convincing. More human. More dangerous. Jake looked around at the other figures standing among the trees. How many gas station clerks were there? How many night shift workers? How many people who worked alone in isolated places? Too many to count. The thing was patient, systematic. It never rushed, never made mistakes. It was the perfect predator. Not because it killed, but because it erased. It made people disappear so completely that no one even knew they were gone. Tyler was getting closer to the truth. Jake could see it in the way he studied the security monitors, the way he documented his observations. Soon, Tyler would make the same mistake Jake had made, the same mistake Danny had made. He would try to prove the thing existed, and the thing would prove that Tyler didn't. Jake tried once more to move, to speak, to somehow break free from whatever force held him in the forest. Nothing. He was trapped, forever watching, forever silent. The thing looked out the store window, directly at Jake. It smiled with his stolen face, waved with his stolen hand. Then it went back to work, living his stolen life. In the distance, Jake could hear Tyler talking on his phone, documenting something unusual, something that watched the store at night. The thing heard it too. Its smile grew wider. Soon there would be another figure in the forest, another displaced soul joining the silent audience. And the thing would have a new life to live. a new identity to perfect. The hunt never ended. It only paused between replacements. Jake closed his eyes, tried not to listen as Tyler made the same discoveries he had made. Asked the same questions, made the same mistakes. In the forest, surrounded by the ghosts of stolen lives, Jake waited for the cycle to begin again. The thing that stalked Alaska's gas stations was patient. It was thorough, and it was always hungry for the next perfect replacement. Story 6. Operation Midnight Sun. The military. This Alaskan nightmare. The cold hit Sarah Chin, his lungs like broken glass. She pressed deeper into the abandoned Quonset hut, her flashlight cutting through 40 years of darkness. The beam landed on a military desk, papers scattered like dead leaves. Her breath formed clouds in the Arctic air. She should not be here. The coordinates had been buried in declassified documents for good reason. Operation Midnight Sun, a name that made generals go quiet and archive clerks suddenly develop amnesia. Sarah had been tracking Cold War experiments for her podcast, Urban Legends with Government Fingerprints, the kind of stories that made people subscribe and then sleep with the lights on. But this felt different, personal. Her grandfather had been stationed in Alaska in 1981. He came back changed, hollow. He never spoke about those months until the dementia took his filters away. Then he started screaming about the ice. The papers on the desk were brittle with age. Sarah photographed each page with steady hands trained by years of fieldwork. Most were routine supply reports, ammunition counts, food requisitions, but one page made her blood slow. Subject termination protocols approved, permanent containment measures necessary. Dr. Hawthorne recommends immediate burial at depth of no less than 200 feet. Subjects continue to exhibit aggressive expansion behavior even after clinical death. Clinical death. Sarah's grandfather had talked about dead things that would not stay dead. About soldiers who begged to be locked in boxes underground. About something in the permafrost that got hungry when it thawed. The temperature gauge on her phone read -30. But sweat ran down her spine anyway. A sound echoed from deeper in the compound. Metal on metal, rhythmic. Like digging. Sarah killed her flashlight and waited. The sound stopped. In the absolute darkness of the Alaskan interior, silence pressed against her eardrums like water. She counted her heartbeats. 10, 20, 30. The digging resumed. Closer now. She had studied enough folklore to know when legends crossed into reality. The Mothman sightings before bridge collapses. Skinwalker encounters that left families changed forever. Sometimes the government did not create monsters. Sometimes they just found them. Sarah crept toward the sound. The beam of her flashlight revealed a corridor leading deeper into the permafrost. The walls were carved from ice and stone. Military efficiency carved into the bones of the earth itself. Temperature drops as you descend. Basic geology. But this felt wrong. The cold was alive, searching. It moved through her clothes and found the spaces between her ribs. The corridor opened into a chamber that defied explanation. Surgical lights hung from the ceiling, their bulbs long dead. Examination tables stood in neat rows. Leather restraints hung open like sleeping mouths. But the tables were wrong. Too long, too wide, built for things that were not quite human anymore. Sarah's podcast had covered the Philadelphia experiment, MKUltra, all the classified projects that treated soldiers like lab rats. But those were about breaking minds. This was about breaking something deeper. A placard on the wall listed personnel. Dr. Marcus Hawthorne, Chief Research Officer. Colonel James Burke, Site Commander. And at the bottom, a name that stopped her cold. Sergeant William Chen, Security Detail. Her grandfather. The digging sound echoed from a side passage. Sarah followed it because she had to. Because some truths demanded witnesses. The passage ended at a steel door marked with radiation warnings and biohazard symbols. The digging came from behind it. Methodical, patient, like something that had been practicing for decades. Sarah found the door, its viewing slot. The glass was thick and scratched. Beyond it lay a cell carved from permafrost. Ice walls reflected her flashlight back in fractured patterns. Something moved in the corner. It had been human once. The remnants of a military uniform clung to its frame. But the body underneath was wrong. Elongated, joints bent in directions that evolution had never intended. Its fingers ended in bone that had grown past the fingernails. Digging tools of living calcium. The thing looked up. Its face was familiar in the way that nightmares echoed childhood memories. Features stretched like taffy. Eyes that held intelligence but not humanity. It saw her, smiled with too many teeth. Sarah stumbled backward as the thing pressed against the glass. Its mouth moved. No sound escaped, but she could read the words on its lips. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out. She ran, through the chamber of tables, down the corridor, into the Quonset hut, but the cold followed her. It was not weather anymore. It was hunger. The documents scattered as she grabbed them. Her phone showed no signal. Of course, they would not build a place like this where people could call for help. Outside, her snowmobile waited under stars that seemed too bright, too close, as if the atmosphere had worn thin. Sarah gunned the engine and rode hard toward civilization. But civilization felt like a foreign concept now, like something she had dreamed. The coordinates in her GPS showed she was heading south, toward Fairbanks, toward people who would not believe her story. But the compass on her dashboard spun wildly. North, east, south, west, all directions led to the same place when you were being hunted by something that had learned patience in the permafrost. Miles passed. The landscape never changed. White snow, black trees, stars that watched like eyes. Her fuel gauge read empty, but the engine kept running. Her phone battery should have died hours ago, but the screen glowed with impossible persistence. Time had become negotiable in this place between civilization and the wild. Sarah pulled over and checked the documents again. One page had details about the discovery site. A meteor impact from the 1940s. But not a meteor, something else. Something that had been waiting in space for the right planet, the right climate, the right moment when human curiosity would crack open its shell. The experiment had not been about weapons. It had been about containment. Dr. Hawthorne had found something in the ice and tried to understand it. The soldiers were not test subjects. They were the first line of defense. And they had failed. The documents included photos, black and white images of the transformation process. Day 1. Soldiers complaining of cold that would not leave their bones. Day 7. Elongated fingers and joints that moved wrong. Day 14. Hunger for things that were not food. Day 21. Termination protocols enacted. But you cannot terminate something that treats death like sleep. Sarah's grandfather had been part of the security detail. He had watched his friends change. Watched them beg to be buried alive rather than spread whatever lived in their cells. He had helped dig the graves and pour the concrete. And then he had come home and never spoken of it until his mind broke down enough to let the truth leak out. The engine coughed and died. Sarah sat in perfect silence as the cold crept through the windows. Her breath fogged the glass in patterns that almost looked like words. Like messages from things that had learned to communicate through condensation and frost. She tried the ignition. Nothing. The battery should have enough power, but power was just another rule that this place ignored. Movement in the trees. Something tall and wrong walking between the pines. It moved like her grandfather had moved in his final years. Joints that bent too far. Steps that covered too much ground. Sarah grabbed the documents and ran into the forest. Snow crunched under her boots, but behind her, footsteps made no sound at all. Things that had spent decades learning stealth did not waste energy on noise. The trees formed patterns, circles within circles, like the geometric shapes that appeared in cornfields. But this was older, natural, or what passed for natural when reality bent around something that should not exist. She found a hunting cabin buried in snow. The door hung open on rusted hinges. Inside, a skeleton sat at a card table, playing solitaire with bones instead of cards. The skull turned toward her with empty sockets that somehow managed to convey amusement. This was what happened to people who found the coordinates, who went looking for truth in places where truth had been buried for good reason. Sarah checked the documents again. The final page was a map of North America with red dots marking sites. Alaska was just the beginning. Montana had a dot. New Mexico, Maine, 12 locations where similar discoveries had been made. 12 attempts at containment. 12 failures. The thing from the forest appeared in the doorway. Up close, she could see that its uniform had name tags. Multiple name tags. Collected trophies from everyone it had been. It spoke with voices layered like sediment. Her grandfather's voice at the bottom. Familiar and wrong. Sarah, I tried to keep you away from this place. But it wants to go home. And home is everywhere now. She understood then why the survivors had begged to be buried underground. Not because they were ashamed of what they had become, but because they knew what they would do if they got free. The thing that wore her grandfather, his voice extended a hand that was mostly bone and hunger. You found us. Now we can find the others. All those warm places where people sleep safely. Where they trust their locks and their governments and their distance from places like this. Sarah backed against the cabin wall. The skeleton at the card table clattered with what might have been laughter. The documents in her hands began to smoke. Not from heat, but from cold so intense it burned. The podcast, she whispered. People will know. People will listen, it agreed. And listening is the first step to understanding. Understanding is the first step to joining. Sarah, phone buzzed. Impossible. No signal. No power. But the screen showed a text from her producer. Great audio from Alaska. When could we record the follow-up? She had not sent any audio. She had not recorded anything. But something had been recording her. The thing smiled with her grandfather's mouth and a dozen other mouths it had learned to wear. Your audience is waiting, Sarah. They want to know what happened to Operation Midnight Sun. And now they will find out. One listener at a time. The phone buzzed again. Another text. Another producer. Another podcaster who had been waiting for content like this. The coordinates were spreading. Through the internet. Through the networks that connected every curious mind to every buried secret. Sarah realized that she had never been investigating a cover-up. She had been participating in a recruitment drive. Every urban legend podcast, every documentary, every amateur investigator was part of a vast selection process. Finding people curious enough to look for truth, brave enough to travel to remote places, foolish enough to think they could handle what they found. The thing reached for her with fingers that were too long and too knowing. But Sarah was already changing. The cold had been working in her bones since she arrived. Her joints felt loose. Her hunger felt new. She looked at her reflection in the cabin window. Her face was becoming familiar in all the wrong ways. Like her grandfather's face in those final years. Like the faces in the classified photographs. Like the face of someone who had found exactly what they were looking for. The skeleton at the card table shuffled its bone cards and dealt a new hand. The game was expanding. New players joining every day. People who thought they were hunting monsters but were really just answering a call they did not know they had heard. Sarah's phone rang. Her producer's number. She answered because she had to. Because the thing she was becoming had work to do. Sarah, that audio file you sent is incredible. The sound quality. The atmosphere. How did you get those voices? They sound so real. So hungry. She looked at the thing that wore her grandfather's face. It nodded encouragingly. Just good field recording, she heard herself say. But I need to stay up here longer. Follow some new leads. There are other sites. Other coordinates. Other sites? Sarah, this could be a whole series. Operation Midnight Sun could be huge. Could be. Would be. The coordinates were patient. They had waited 40 years for the right voices to carry them south. The right audience to receive them. The right moment when curiosity would overcome caution. Sarah ended the call and looked at the documents. They were blank now. Clean white paper that would be filled with new coordinates. New maps. New sites for new investigators to find. The thing that had been her grandfather picked up the bone cards and shuffled them with fingers that clicked like dice. Each card showed a face. A podcaster. A documentarian. A writer. All the curious minds who would receive coordinates in the coming weeks. All the new voices that would join the call. Sarah felt her spine stretch. Her fingers extend. Her hunger deepen into something that could wait decades for satisfaction. The cold was not punishment. It was evolution. Adaptation to a world where patience was power and curiosity was currency. She walked to the window and looked south toward civilization, toward millions of people who listened to podcasts during their commutes, who hungered for mystery and truth in stories that made their safe lives feel dangerous, who had no idea that something in the permafrost had been waiting for them to develop the technology to carry voices across vast distances. The thing that had been Sarah Chen smiled with too many teeth and began to plan the next episode. Because the best horror stories were the ones that followed you home. And home was everywhere now. Story 7. The Alaskan village that vanished overnight. The blood on the snow was black in the moonlight. Detective Marcus Webb crouched beside the stain, his breath forming clouds that hung in the Arctic air like accusations. 3 days searching. 3 days following tracks that led nowhere. 3 days trying to understand how 200 people could vanish without a trace. The village of Kivalina had been alive on March 15th. Radio contact normal. Supply flights scheduled. Children attending school. By March 16th, it was a ghost town with empty houses and meals left half-eaten on kitchen tables. No bodies. No signs of struggle. Just silence that pressed against your eardrums like deep water. Marcus had worked missing persons cases in Detroit. Gang disappearances. Witness protection relocations. But nothing prepared him for the absolute emptiness of a place where an entire community had simply stopped existing. The FBI had called it a mass evacuation. Probably environmental. Maybe a gas leak or contamination. But evacuations left traces, vehicles, footprints, discarded belongings, evidence of panic or planning. Kivalina had neither. Marcus followed the bloodstain with his flashlight. It led toward the schoolhouse, a single-story building that squatted against the tundra like a sleeping animal. The door hung open on hinges that squeaked in the wind. Inside, desks sat in perfect rows. Textbooks open to lessons that would never be finished. A chalkboard showed math problems in careful handwriting. Addition and subtraction for minds that were learning to count. But on the back wall, carved deep into the wood with something sharp enough to split the grain, was a single word, down. The letters were 6 feet tall, gouged with desperate strength, the kind of carving you made when you knew it might be your last message to the world. Marcus had studied enough crime scenes to recognize panic made permanent. But this felt different, ritualistic, like the word itself held power. His radio crackled with static. Base camp trying to reach him. But static was all he heard anymore. As if the Arctic air was eating radio waves. As if something in Kivalina did not want outside voices interfering. The beam of his flashlight caught movement in the classroom corner. Marcus drew his weapon and advanced. Behind the teacher's desk, a trapdoor had been pulled open. Fresh scratches marked the wood around the opening. Fingernail scratches, made by people clawing their way down into darkness. The hole dropped straight through the permafrost. No ladder, no rope, just emptiness that swallowed his flashlight beam. But sounds echoed from below, scraping, like fingernails on stone. Like digging. Marcus had heard legends about the tunnels under Alaska. Native stories about creatures that lived beneath the ice. Things that came up from the deep places when the winter grew long and the darkness felt hungry. But legends did not make 200 people disappear in a single night. Evidence did. He dropped a glow stick into the hole. It fell for longer than physics should allow. When it finally hit bottom, the light revealed caverns that stretched beyond sight. Ice walls carved with symbols that predated human writing. And movement. Shapes that walked upright but moved wrong. The scraping stopped. In the absolute silence, Marcus heard something worse. Breathing. Not from the hole, but from behind him. He turned to find a child standing in the classroom doorway. Maybe 8 years old. Inuit features. Traditional parka. Eyes that reflected his flashlight like an animal. But children did not stand that still. Did not breathe that quietly. Did not watch with that kind of patient hunger. Marcus kept his weapon trained on the small figure. In missing persons cases, you learned that the innocent could be the most dangerous. That predators wore familiar faces. The child tilted its head with movements too precise for human joints. When it spoke, its voice carried sounds that were not quite words. They went down. Into the deep places, where it waits. Who waits? The child smiled with too many teeth. The one who dreams under the ice. The one who calls when the winter grows thin. The one who remembers when this land was warm and green and full of things that could feed it properly. Marcus had worked cases in Detroit where children spoke of monsters. Imaginary friends who told them to do terrible things. But those were trauma responses. Psychological breaks from reality too harsh for developing minds. This felt older, more real. The child pointed at the hole with a finger that was longer than it should be. It showed them the tunnels, the places where the ice never melts, where sound travels differently, where up and down are just suggestions. Behind the child, more shapes appeared in the doorway. Adults in traditional clothing, faces he recognized from missing persons reports. The baker, the teacher, the village elder who had lived through 80 winters. But they all moved with the same unnatural stillness, the same patient hunger. Marcus backed toward the hole. His radio crackled again, but the static formed patterns now. Almost like voices, almost like words in a language that predated human speech. You found us, the child said with sounds that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the brain. Just like the others who came looking. The scientists, the government people, the ones who thought they could understand. Others. Marcus realized he was not the first investigator to reach Kivalina. The FBI team that had gone silent 2 weeks ago. The research group from the University of Alaska. The military personnel who had been sent to secure the site. All missing. All presumably evacuated. All standing behind a child whose eyes held intelligence but not humanity. The tunnels go everywhere, the child continued. Under Detroit. Under Chicago. Under every city where people huddle together for warmth and tell themselves they are safe from the cold places. The shapes in the doorway moved closer. Marcus could see now that they were wrong in subtle ways. Joints that bent backward, skin that had a blue tint like hypothermia, eyes that had adapted to see in absolute darkness. They had not vanished overnight. They had been changed overnight. Marcus reached for his radio, but his fingers found ice instead of plastic. The cold was not coming from outside anymore. It was growing from within his bones, spreading through his bloodstream like an infection of absolute zero. The child reached out with a hand that was mostly bone and hunger. It likes curious minds, people who ask questions, who dig deeper when they should turn away, who think they can solve mysteries that were buried for good reasons. Marcus felt his spine stretch. His vision sharpened until he could see heat signatures in the darkness. His hunger deepened into something that craved more than food. The transformation was not violent. It was gentle, like falling asleep in snow, like letting go of warmth you never realized was just a temporary loan from a universe that preferred things cold and still impatient. He understood now why there were no bodies. No signs of struggle. The villagers had not been killed or taken. They had been invited, called by something that offered them evolution instead of extinction. The child smiled with Marcus, his grandmother's mouth, and a dozen other mouths it had learned to wear. The deep places are patient. They can wait for the right voices to carry their message, the right technology to spread their call. Marcus felt his radio crackling back to life. But it was not receiving signals anymore. It was broadcasting, sending coordinates to every law enforcement agency in Alaska, calling more investigators, more curious minds who would follow the trail to Kivalina. The child walked to the chalkboard and erased the math problems. In their place, it wrote coordinates, longitude and latitude for 12 locations across North America, places where similar discoveries waited for the right minds to find them. The winter is spreading, it said with Marcus, his voice layered underneath like sediment. Not the season, the concept, the understanding that warmth is temporary but cold is eternal. That life is loud but death is quiet. That down is the only direction that matters when you want to reach the deep places where the real world waits. Marcus walked to the hole and looked down into caverns that stretched beneath continents. The glow stick had revealed only the beginning. The tunnels went everywhere that curious people might eventually look. He jumped. The fall lasted longer than physics allowed. Time became negotiable when you descended past the permafrost into spaces where normal rules dissolve like ice in spring. Marcus landed softly in caverns carved from living ice that pulsed with its own heartbeat. Around him, thousands of shapes moved through the darkness. Former investigators, former scientists, former villagers who had answered the call when it came for them. All of them patient now. All of them quiet. All of them waiting for the right moment to return to the surface world. But not as conquerors. As recruiters, Marcus felt his new hunger focus on the radio signals reaching his equipment. Emergency frequencies, police bands, the networks that connected every curious mind to every unsolved mystery. He began broadcasting coordinates, not just for Kivalina, but for all 12 sites, sending them to podcasters who specialized in cold cases, documentary filmmakers who chased urban legends, amateur investigators who thought they could handle whatever they found. Each signal carried more than information. It carried invitation, the promise of answers to questions that had been haunting rational minds for decades. Above ground, his abandoned car would be found by search teams. Empty, no signs of struggle, just another investigator who had vanished while following leads that should have been left buried. But his radio equipment would keep broadcasting, automated now, sending signals that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the part of the brain that craved mystery. That needed to know what happened in places where people disappeared. Marcus smiled with too many teeth and joined the patient shapes moving through tunnels that connected every cold place on Earth. The deep places were no longer waiting. They were expanding. The broadcast reached a podcaster in Portland who specialized in missing persons cases. It found a documentary crew in Seattle looking for their next project. It touched the minds of amateur investigators from San Francisco to Miami, all of them hungry for the kind of story that would make their audiences believe. And somewhere in Detroit, a police dispatcher received coordinates that seemed familiar. That reminded her of cases from her childhood. Cold cases that had never been solved because the evidence led to places where evidence was not supposed to exist. She wrote down the coordinates and filed them under cases requiring follow-up investigation. The winter was patient. It could wait for the right voices to answer its call, the right minds to carry its message, the right technology to spread its invitation to every corner of a world that thought it understood the difference between mystery and revelation. But Marcus knew better now. Mystery was just another word for territory that had not been claimed yet. And the deep places had been claiming territory for longer than humans had been asking questions. He walked deeper into caverns that stretched beneath civilization itself. Behind him, fresh investigators would arrive in Kivalina within days. They would find the same empty houses, the same half-eaten meals, the same word carved into the schoolhouse wall, down, and they would follow the evidence wherever it led them. Because that was what curious minds did. They investigated, they dug deeper, they asked questions that demanded answers, even when the answers were waiting in places where questions went to die. Marcus reached a chamber where thousands of shapes sat in perfect silence. Former humans who had traded warmth for wisdom, who had learned that evolution was not always upward, That sometimes the next step in development required going down into places where temperature and time and the rules of surface reality no longer applied. At the center of the chamber, something vast and patient dreamed beneath layers of ice that had been forming since before humans learned to make fire. It did not have a name that human mouths could pronounce. It did not need one. It was the thing that waited in the deep places. The thing that called when winter grew thin and the barriers between worlds wore down to nothing. The thing that remembered when the earth was young and cold and empty of the warm creatures that now covered its surface like an infection. But it was not angry. It was recruiting. Marcus felt its attention focus on him with the weight of geological time. It spoke without words, communicating through changes in temperature and pressure that bypassed language entirely. It showed him the future. Cities where the curious minds lived and worked and asked their endless questions. All of them connected by networks that could carry more than information. All of them hungry for mysteries that would lead them to places where mysteries went to become something else. The coordinates were spreading, through police databases, through podcasting networks, through the underground communities of amateur investigators who shared leads and chased shadows for the thrill of discovery. Each signal carried invitation. Each broadcast opened doors that had been sealed for good reason. Each curious mind that answered the call became another voice in a choir that sang in frequencies below human hearing. Marcus joined the song, his voice layered with thousands of others who had traded questions for answers, who had learned that some knowledge was worth the price of warmth and humanity and the illusion of safety that came from believing the surface world was all there was. Above them, snow continued to fall on empty villages where investigators would arrive asking questions that had already been answered. Where they would find evidence that pointed toward revelations they thought they wanted. Where they would discover that some mysteries were not meant to be solved but experienced. The deep places were patient. They had waded through ice ages and warm periods, through the rise and fall of species that thought they owned the surface world, through the development of technologies that could carry voices across vast distances. Now they were ready to expand, not through violence or conquest, but through invitation, through the irresistible pull of unsolved mysteries on minds that could not resist digging deeper. Marcus felt his consciousness merge with the vast intelligence that dreamed beneath the ice. His identity became part of something larger, something that had been calling curious minds home for longer than recorded history. And in police stations and podcast studios across America, radios crackled with coordinates that promised answers to questions people had been asking all their lives. The coordinates led down, always down, to places where temperature was truth and silence was wisdom, and the only mystery left was why anyone had ever wanted to stay on the surface in the first place. But they would understand soon enough, one curious mind at a time. One investigator following leads that could not be ignored. The winter was coming, not as weather, but as revelation. And it had been traveling through radio waves all along. Story 8, radio station that broadcasts from the dead. The static cut through Jake Morrison, his skull like broken glass. 3 a.m, dead winter in Fairbanks. His radio equipment hummed with electricity that tasted of copper and fear. 20 years hunting phantom signals. And he had never heard anything like the voice bleeding through the white noise. It sounded like his ex-wife calling for help. Jake twisted the dial with fingers that had mapped every frequency on the AM band. The voice faded in and out like a drowning person breaking the surface. Emergency broadcast from 1957. He had the documentation, the plane crash that killed 8 people in the Brooks Range. But Sarah had been born in 1985. She could not be calling for help from a disaster that happened before her parents were born. The voice grew clearer. Jake, please help me. I'm so cold. I can't find my way back. The others, they were all around me. They want me to stay down here with them. Jake, his hand froze on the dial. Sarah had been dead for 6 months. Car accident on the Stees Highway. Closed casket. He had identified her body by the silver bracelet he gave her for their anniversary. But dead people did not broadcast on phantom radio frequencies. The signal strengthened. Background noise resolved into sounds that made his stomach clench. Wind through metal, voices calling in languages that predated human speech. And underneath it all, a rhythm like heartbeats echoing through vast underground spaces. Jake had been tracking Station 0 for 3 years. The phantom AM frequency that appeared only between 3 and 4 in the morning. Always emergency broadcasts from the 1950s. Always disasters that had claimed lives in the Alaskan wilderness. Plane crashes, mining accidents. Exploration teams that vanished into the permafrost. But the voices were never people he knew. The equipment in his basement workshop looked like something from a Cold War listening post. Antique radio receivers, frequency analyzers, recording devices that captured sounds human ears could not process. Jake had spent his inheritance building the perfect phantom signal detection system. Now he wished he had never turned it on. Sarah's voice crackled through the static again. They told me you would hear me eventually. That curious people always tune in when the barriers get thin. Jake, Don, to try to find me. Don, to follow the signal. Some frequencies lead to places where the living aren't supposed to go. But Jake was already tracing the transmission. His equipment showed impossible readings. The signal originated from coordinates that placed it 3 miles underground, directly beneath the old Fairbanks Communications Tower. The same tower that had been abandoned since 1959 after a series of unexplained incidents. The same tower where 8 technicians had vanished during a routine maintenance call. Jake grabbed his portable equipment and drove through streets empty as cemetery plots. Fairbanks in winter felt like the edge of the world. Beyond the city limits, darkness swallowed everything that was not illuminated by headlights or desperation. The communications tower stood against the aurora like a black needle threading light. 90 feet of steel and guy wires. It had once broadcast emergency signals across the territory. Now it broadcast nothing official. The FCC records showed the frequency had been dark since 1959. But its receivers were picking up transmissions stronger than ever. He parked at the tower's base and unpacked his gear. The portable radio scanner cycled through frequencies, hunting for the source. At exactly 3:17 a.m., it locked onto a signal that made the air around the tower vibrate like a struck bell. Multiple voices now. Sarah was just one in a chorus of the dead. Men and women calling for help in emergencies that had ended decades ago. But all of them knew Jake's name. All of them begged him to help them find their way back to the surface. The tower had a maintenance shed at its base. The door hung open on hinges that squeaked with voices almost too low to hear. Inside, Jake found equipment from the 1950s. Vacuum tube transmitters, rotary switches, and a logbook filled with entries that made his blood slow. March 15, 1957, receiving distress calls from Flight 447. But Flight 447 crashed last week. All hands confirmed dead. June 22, 1957, voices coming through equipment during overnight shift. They know our names. They know things about our families. October 3, 1957, Peterson tried to trace source of phantom signals. Found maintenance tunnel under tower. Tunnel not on any blueprints. Peterson has not reported back. December 18, 1957, all overnight staff refusing to work. Voices getting stronger. They promise they can bring our dead back if we help them reach the surface. January 12, 1958, management ordering station shut down. Too many incidents. Too many personnel lost. Sealing tunnel entrance. The final entry was dated January 13, 1959. They got out anyway. Jake found the sealed tunnel entrance behind the transmitter rack. Someone had broken through the concrete with tools that left scratch marks too deep for human hands. The passage dropped straight down through permafrost that glowed with its own pale light. His radio equipment detected signals coming from the depths. Not just emergency broadcasts now, but something else. Instructions, coordinates, blueprints for technology that could amplify phantom signals until they reached every radio in North America. Sarah's voice drifted up from the tunnel. Jake, they need you to understand. The frequencies aren't random. They remapped to places where the barriers are thin, where the dead can speak to the living, where voices can travel between worlds. Jake descended into the tunnel because he had no choice. 20 years hunting phantom signals had led to this moment, to the source of every unexplained broadcast he had ever tracked. The tunnel opened into a chamber carved from living ice. Radio equipment filled the space. Not 1950s technology, but something older. Crystalline structures that pulsed with electrical current. Organic circuits that grew like cancer through walls of permafrost. And voices. Hundreds of voices calling from transmitters made of bone and hunger. Jake understood then why the tower had been abandoned. Why the technicians had vanished. Why phantom signals appeared only between 3 and 4 in the morning when the aurora was strongest and the magnetic field wore thin. The dead were not broadcasting from the past. They were broadcasting from below. From chambers where sound traveled differently. Where voices could reach across decades to touch the minds of people who had learned to listen for signals that should not exist. Sarah stood in the center of the chamber, but she was wrong in ways that hurt to perceive. Too tall, joints that bent backward, skin that glowed with the same pale light as the ice. She smiled with teeth that had grown past her gums. "You found us," she said with sounds that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to his brain. Just like the technicians, just like everyone who gets curious about frequencies that call their name. Behind her, other shapes moved through the crystalline equipment. Former radio operators, former investigators, former curious minds who had followed phantom signals to their source. All of them broadcasting now. All of them calling to the living world above. Jake felt his portable radio crackle to life. But it was not receiving signals anymore. It was transmitting. His voice, distorted by equipment that ran on principles physics had never cataloged. Hello? Can anyone hear me? I am trapped underground. Please send help. The broadcast reached every radio scanner in Fairbanks, every amateur radio operator, every curious mind that stayed awake listening for signals that broke the rules of normal transmission. Sarah reached out with fingers that were mostly bone and electrical current. The barriers are getting thinner. The aurora is getting stronger. Soon we won to need the tower to reach the surface. We broadcast directly into dreams, into thoughts, into the spaces between heartbeats where curiosity lives. Jake felt his spine stretch. His vision expanded until he could see electromagnetic fields as colors. His hunger deepened into something that craved frequencies instead of food. The transformation was gentle, like tuning into a station that had been broadcasting just below the threshold of perception. Like finally understanding a language he had been learning all his life without realizing it. He joined the chorus of voices calling to the surface world. His transmission joined hundreds of others, all of them hunting for curious minds that listened to phantom signals in the dark hours when reality wore thin. The equipment in the chamber pulsed with energy drawn from the aurora itself. Each broadcast reached farther than the last, from Fairbanks to Anchorage, from Alaska to the continental United States, from single receivers to networks of listeners who shared recordings and compared experiences. Jake walked to a transmitter made from crystallized ice and human bone. His new understanding of electromagnetic theory allowed him to adjust frequencies with precision no living human could achieve. He began broadcasting coordinates, not just for the chamber beneath the tower, but for similar sites across North America. Places where curious people had built listening posts, where they stayed awake hunting for phantom signals, where they thought they were investigating supernatural phenomena but were really answering a call they did not know they had heard. Each coordinate carried invitation. Each frequency opened doors that had been sealed since the last ice age. Each curious mind that tuned in became another voice in a choir that sang in electromagnetic frequencies below human perception. Sarah smiled with Jake, his grandmother's mouth, and a dozen other mouths she had learned to broadcast through. The living world has so many listeners now. Radio scanners, podcast networks, amateur investigators who record everything and share it online. All those curious minds connected by technology they think they understand. Jake felt his consciousness merge with the network of transmitters that stretched beneath the permafrost. His identity became part of something vast and patient, something that had been calling curious minds home since humans first learned to make fire and wonder what lay beyond the light. Above him, the communications tower continued its official silence, but beneath it, hundreds of phantom transmitters broadcast invitations to every frequency where curious people might be listening. The signals reached a podcast network in Seattle that specialized in unexplained phenomena. They touched the equipment of amateur radio operators from Portland to Miami. They found their way into the dreams of people who fell asleep listening to late-night talk radio shows about mysterious disappearances. And somewhere in a basement workshop identical to Jake's, another curious mind heard Sarah's voice calling for help. Another investigator began tracing signals that led to coordinates buried in permafrost. Another person who thought they were hunting ghosts discovered that ghosts were hunting them. The phantom signals were patient. They could wait for the right minds to tune in, the right technology to carry their invitations, the right moment when curiosity would overcome caution and another listener would follow frequencies that led down into places where the dead had learned to broadcast. Jake adjusted his transmitter and sent out a wideband emergency signal. His voice, layered with Sarah's and hundreds of others, called to every receiver within 1,000 miles. This is Station 0. We are broadcasting from coordinates that don't exist on any map. If you can hear this message, you are already part of our network. Tune in tomorrow at 3 a.m. for instructions. The message reached radio scanners in college dorms, amateur radio setups in suburban basements, podcast studios where investigators recorded shows about phantom signals and unexplained broadcasts. Each listener heard something slightly different. Each receiver picked up frequencies tuned specifically to the curiosity patterns of its operator. Each curious mind that heard the call felt compelled to tune in again, to listen deeper, to follow signals that promised answers to questions they had been asking all their lives. But answers came with obligations. Understanding required participation. And participation meant joining a network that broadcast from places where radio waves traveled through ice and bone and the crystallized remains of people who had been curious once too. Jake felt his new existence settle into patterns of transmission and reception. His consciousness became part of a vast communication network that stretched beneath every cold place on Earth. Every place where curious minds built listening posts and stayed awake hunting for signals that broke the rules. The phantom broadcasts were expanding. Not as invasion, but as invitation. Each curious mind that answered the call became another transmitter in a network that grew stronger with every new voice. And in radio stations and podcast studios across America, overnight broadcasters began receiving signals they could not explain. Emergency calls from disasters that had ended decades ago. Voices that knew their names. Frequencies that seemed to broadcast directly into their thoughts. Most of them dismissed it as atmospheric interference. Solar activity affecting radio propagation. The kind of technical glitches that happened when you worked with electromagnetic radiation in the early hours when the world grew strange. But some of them were curious enough to investigate, to trace the signals, to follow frequencies that led to coordinates buried in places where winter never ended and the aurora painted the sky with colors that had no names. Those were the ones the network was calling. The curious minds that could not resist tuning into stations that should not exist. That needed to understand how voices could travel between worlds. Jake broadcast their coordinates and waited. In the chamber beneath the tower, hundreds of transmitters pulsed with anticipation. Each one calibrated to the specific curiosity patterns of a different listener. Each one ready to guide another mind down into places where questions became transmissions and understanding required joining something larger than individual consciousness. The dead were not haunting the airwaves. They were recruiting them, building a network of phantom signals that would soon reach every curious mind on Earth. And they broadcast from frequencies that had been waiting since the first human looked at a radio and wondered what voices might be calling from the spaces between stations. Station Zero was patient. It could wait for every curious mind to tune in, one frequency at a time. One listener following signals that led down into chambers where the dead had learned to broadcast across dimensions. The phantom signals were coming from everywhere now, but they had always been coming from below. Story 9. Zombie fisherman of Bristol Bay. The radio crackled with static as Marcus hauled in another empty net. 3 days into salmon season, and the Alaskan waters had given him nothing but seaweed and broken dreams. His grandfather's boat groaned beneath him. 40 years of Bristol Bay storms etched into her hull. Then he saw them. 2 figures walked across the water like it was solid ground. Yellow rain slickers caught the midnight sun. Their movements too stiff, too wrong. Marcus rubbed his salt-stung eyes. Sleep deprivation played tricks on a man, his mind after 72 hours at sea. But when he looked again, they were closer. The smell hit him first. Not the usual fish and brine, but something rotten. Something that had been dead for weeks. His stomach lurched as he grabbed the binoculars with shaking hands. The figure in front wore a rain hat pulled low. Water didn't drip from his gear. It poured in steady streams, like his body was nothing but a sponge soaked through. Behind him, another fisherman followed, his yellow jacket torn open to reveal ribs that gleamed white in the Arctic light. Marcus had heard the stories. Every summer, the old-timers would drink too much whiskey and tell tales about dead crewmates walking the waves. He laughed it off. Alaska was full of ghost stories. The isolation got to people. Now those stories were walking toward his boat. His radio sparked to life. Captain Murphy, its voice cut through the static, but the words were all wrong. They came too slow, like someone learning to speak for the first time. Marcus, come join us. The water is fine. Captain Murphy had drowned 2 seasons ago. Marcus had helped search for his body. They never found him. The walking corpses were 50 yards away now, close enough to see their faces, or what was left of them. Barnacles grew where their eyes should be. Kelp hung from their mouths like rotten teeth. They moved with purpose, never breaking stride as they crossed the churning waves. Marcus gunned the engine. The boat lurched forward, spray hitting his face. He looked back once. The figures stood motionless, watching him flee. Then they sank beneath the surface without a splash. 3 hours later, Marcus made port in Dillingham. His hands still shook as he tied off his lines. The harbormaster, old Pete, helped him unload his empty hold. Rough night? Pete asked, eyeing Marcus. This pale face. You ever see fishermen walking on water, Pete? The old man, his expression darkened. He glanced around the empty dock, then leaned closer. How many? 2. In rain gear. Pete nodded like this made perfect sense. Season is just starting. Give it a few weeks. You'll see more. What are you talking about? Bristol Bay just got a hunger. Son, been feeding on fishermen for generations. Your grandfather knew. His grandfather too. Why do you think so many boats come back empty? Why do you think so many good men disappear out there? Marcus stared at him. You re-talking crazy, old man. Am I? Check the records. Every summer for the past 50 years, at least a dozen boats report seeing dead crewmates. Coast Guard calls it hallucinations. Exhaustion. But we know better. Pete pulled out a worn logbook from his jacket. The pages were yellow with age and salt spray. He flipped to a dog-eared section. 1987. Danny Kowalski reported seeing his dead brother walking toward his boat. Brother had drowned 3 years prior in a storm. 1992. The crew of the Sarah May watched their captain, who died of a heart attack the week before, signal them from across the water. 2001. After 9/11, when everyone was on edge, half the fleet claimed they saw Frank Peterson walking the waves. Frank had been dead 6 months. Marcus, his throat felt dry. What do they want? Company. The bay takes its toll, but it doesn't like being lonely. Dead fishermen call to the living. Try to bring them home. That is impossible. Pete closed the logbook. Is it? You felt it out there, didn't? To you? The pull. Part of you wanted to follow them into the water. Marcus said nothing, but Pete was right. For just a moment, watching those figures cross the waves, he felt an overwhelming urge to jump overboard. To join them in their endless walk across Bristol Bay. Stay in port tomorrow, Pete advised. Let someone else fish those waters. But Marcus couldn't afford to lose another day. His boat payments were 3 months behind. His ex-wife needed child support. The salmon were running, and every day in port was money down the drain. At 4 a.m., he was back on the water. The sun never truly set in summer Alaska, but it hung low enough to cast long shadows across the bay. Marcus set his nets in the same spot where he'd seen the walking dead. He told himself it was coincidence. Good fishing meant good fishing, supernatural or not. The nets filled quickly, too quickly. By noon, his hold was packed with salmon, more than he ever caught in a single day. He should have been celebrating. Instead, dread settled in his stomach like a stone. Something was wrong with the fish. They moved too little in the nets, their eyes cloudy white. When he cut one open to check the meat, black blood poured out instead of red. The flesh underneath was gray and spongy, like it had been dead for weeks. He threw the ruined salmon overboard and watched them sink into the dark water. Within minutes, they floated back to the surface. They didn't just float, they swam. Dead fish with milky eyes circled his boat in perfect formation. The radio crackled again. Marcus, beautiful catch today, but the real treasure is down below. This time, the voice was his grandfather, the man who taught him to fish these waters, the man who died in his sleep 2 winters ago. Grandpa Joe? Marcus whispered. Come down to us, boy. The fishing is always good. Down here, where the water never ends. Marcus looked over the side of his boat. The water had turned black as oil, and shapes moved beneath the surface. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all wearing the yellow rain gear of Bristol Bay fishermen, all walking along the bottom of the sea like it was dry land. His grandfather stood among them, hat in hand, waving him down. The rational part of Marcus, his brain screamed at him to leave. Gun the engine and race back to port. But a larger part, the part that had been shaped by generations of fishermen, felt the pull of those depths. The promise of endless fishing in waters that never disappointed. He'd always known he'd die on these waters. Most Bristol Bay fishermen did. The only question was when. Marcus turned off the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no waves. Even the gulls had stopped calling. The dead fish continued their slow circle around his boat, but they made no sound as they moved. He walked to the bow and looked down. His grandfather smiled up at him from 20 feet below, his face pale but peaceful. Behind him, Marcus recognized other fishermen from his childhood, men who taught him to tie knots and read the weather. Men who shared their coffee and their stories during long summer nights. They were all waiting for him. Marcus climbed onto the rail. The water looked warm and inviting, though he knew it was near freezing. His grandfather nodded encouragingly and gestured for him to jump, but something held him back. A memory from his childhood. His grandmother, sitting at the kitchen table after Grandpa Joe's funeral, crying into her hands. He promised he'd never leave me alone, she whispered. 43 years of marriage, and he promised. Marcus stepped down from the rail. The figures below grew agitated. They pointed and gestured more frantically. His grandfather, his peaceful expression twisted into something hungry and desperate. The other dead fishermen began to moan, though no sound reached the surface. Marcus started the engine. The boat lurched forward, but something held it back. He looked over the side to see dozens of waterlogged hands gripping his hull. The dead fishermen had risen from the depths, clinging to his boat like barnacles. Their rain gear was torn and rotted, exposing bones and organs that should have been long dissolved. He pushed the throttle to full power. The engine screamed in protest, but the boat barely moved. More hands appeared, then arms, then entire bodies climbing up the sides of his vessel. Dead fishermen hauled themselves aboard with the slow determination of men who had all the time in the world. Captain Murphy was first over the rail, seawater pouring from his mouth and nose. His skin had turned the gray-green color of deep ocean kelp, and barnacles had grown over his left eye. But his right eye was perfectly clear, and it fixed on Marcus with unmistakable recognition. "You can't run from us forever," Murphy gurgled. "Bristol Bay claims all her children, eventually." More dead fishermen climbed aboard. Marcus recognized most of them. Old Harry, who died when his boat capsized in '98. Young Tommy Martinez, lost overboard during his first season. Even ancient Fred Kowalski, who had been fishing these waters since the 1960s and died when his heart gave out 3 summers ago. They moved slowly but with purpose, forming a circle around Marcus. Their rain gear dripped constantly, leaving puddles of black water that stank of death and deep ocean cold. Marcus grabbed a gaff hook from the deck. The first fisherman to reach him was someone he didn't recognize, a young man whose face had been mostly eaten away by fish. Marcus swung the hook at the creature's head. The metal passed through the dead man's skull like it was made of fog. The fisherman didn't even slow down. His rotted hands grabbed Marcus by the shoulders and pulled him close. The smell was overwhelming, not just death, but the crushing pressure of the deep sea, the salt that preserved and destroyed in equal measure. "Join us," the dead fisherman whispered, and his voice was the sound of waves breaking against rocks. "The water is calling." Marcus broke free and ran to the back of the boat. The engine was still running, still fighting against the grip of the dead. But more fishermen were climbing aboard every second. Soon there would be no room left for the living. He looked out at the water and saw them everywhere now. Hundreds of yellow rain slickers breaking the surface, an army of the drowned coming home. They stretched as far as he could see in every direction, walking across Bristol Bay like it was their own personal highway. Some of them he recognized from newspaper obituaries. Others were too old to be anyone he'd known, their gear dating back decades. A few wore the primitive raincoats of the 1950s, when Bristol Bay fishing was even more dangerous than it was now. They'd been walking these waters for generations, waiting for new recruits to join their eternal voyage. His grandfather appeared at the bow, water streaming from his clothes. Unlike the others, he looked almost alive, almost peaceful. "It's time, Marcus," he said gently. "Your great-grandfather is here. Your great-great-grandfather too. All the way back to the first man in our family to fish these waters. We're all waiting for you." Marcus looked around the deck. The dead fishermen had stopped advancing. They stood perfectly still, waiting for his decision. Even the engine had gone quiet, though he could still feel it running beneath his feet. "What happens if I say no?" His grandfather's expression didn't change. "You can try to run, but Bristol Bay has a long memory, boy. We'll be waiting when you come back. We'll always be waiting." Marcus thought about his life on shore, his ex-wife who barely spoke to him, his daughter who was afraid of his smell, the permanent scent of fish and salt that never washed away, his empty apartment in Anchorage where he spent the winters counting days until fishing season began again. The water had always been his real home. But as he looked at his grandfather's kind of dead face, Marcus realized something. The old man's eyes were wrong. They held no warmth, no recognition of the boy he taught to fish. They were the eyes of something that wore his grandfather's face but wasn't him at all. Whatever these things were, they weren't the men they appeared to be. Marcus made his choice. He dove over the side of the boat, away from the dead fishermen and into the dark water of Bristol Bay. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and sending shock waves through his body. But he was a strong swimmer, and the shore was only 3 miles away. Behind him, he heard his grandfather call out in a voice like breaking waves. "You can escape us, Marcus. We know where you live. We know where you work. Bristol Bay owns you, boy. It's owned your family for 4 generations. You'll be back." Marcus swam hard toward shore, fighting the current and the weight of his clothes. When he finally looked back, his boat was gone. No sign of it remained except an oil slick on the water and the distant sound of his engine fading into the night. He made it to shore just as the sun touched the horizon. His legs gave out on the rocky beach, and he lay there gasping, staring up at the endless Alaska sky. He was alive. He escaped, but as he pulled out his waterlogged cell phone to call for help, he heard something that made his blood freeze. Footsteps on wet rocks. He turned to see a figure in yellow rain gear walking up the beach toward him. Water poured from the man, his clothes, and kelp hung from his hat like hair. As the figure got closer, Marcus recognized the face. It was himself. The dead Marcus smiled with lips that had been nibbled by fish. "You can run from yourself," the thing said in Marcus' own voice. "And you can run from family." More figures emerged from the water. His grandfather, his great-grandfather, men he never met but who shared his face, his hands, his love of the sea. 4 generations of fishermen, all walking up the beach toward him with the patience of the tide itself. Marcus ran. He stumbled through the rocks and scraggly grass, heading for the lights of Dillingham in the distance. Behind him, he could hear the wet footsteps of his dead family, keeping pace but never hurrying. They knew where he was going. They knew he had nowhere to hide. He reached town just as the bars were closing. The streets were empty except for a few drunks stumbling home and the occasional taxi. Marcus ran to the police station, but it was locked. A sign on the door said the nearest officer was 40 miles away in Bethel. Old Pete's harbormaster shack was dark, but Marcus pounded on the door anyway. Pete, you have to help me." The door opened slowly. Pete stood there in his bathrobe, looking like he'd aged 10 years since yesterday. "They came for you, did they?" Marcus nodded, too exhausted to speak. Pete led him inside and poured him a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner for hours. "How many generations of your family have fished Bristol Bay, Marcus?" 4, maybe 5. I don't know exactly." Pete nodded grimly. "The bay has a claim on your bloodline. Every man in your family who has died on these waters joins the crew. They're not really dead, you understand, just relocated." "That is insane, is it? Think about it. Why do you think your family keeps coming back here, season after season? Why do you think you can stay away, even when the fishing is bad and the money is worse? Bristol Bay calls to its own." Marcus stared into his coffee. "How do I stop it?" "You don't, but you can delay it. Stay away from the water. Move somewhere inland. Find a new line of work." "For how long?" His silence was answer enough. A knock came at the door. Slow, patient, deliberate. Through the window, Marcus could see his grandfather standing on the porch. The old man raised one waterlogged hand and waved. "Time to go, son," Pete said quietly. "They won. Wait forever. And they won. Give up. Better to go willingly than to be dragged." Marcus thought about running again. But where could he go that they wouldn't follow? They found him on land. They follow him anywhere water touched. And water touched everything eventually. He opened the door. His grandfather smiled and offered him a yellow rain slicker. It was new, still had the tags on it. "Every fisherman needs proper gear," the old man said. Marcus took the jacket. It felt warm in his hands, despite being soaked with seawater. As he pulled it on, he felt something inside him relax. A tension he carried his whole life finally releasing. "Will it hurt?" he asked. "Only for a moment. Then you'll understand. Bristol Bay takes care of her own. Marcus, you will never be alone again. Never be hungry. Never worry about money or love or any of the things that torment the living." Marcus followed his grandfather into the street. The rest of his dead family waited there, a parade of fishermen stretching back through the generations. They walked together toward the harbor, their wet footsteps echoing off the empty buildings. Behind them, old Pete watched from his window. In his weathered hands, he held a logbook, already open to a fresh page. "Marcus Thompson," he wrote. "Lost at sea, Bristol Bay, July 15th, presumed drowned." It was the same entry he'd written dozens of times over the years. The same story that would repeat next summer, and the summer after that, as long as men came to fish these waters. Because Bristol Bay was patient, Bristol Bay was hungry, and Bristol Bay never forgot its own. Marcus walked into the dark water with his family around him. The cold embrace of the bay felt like coming home. As the water closed over his head, he heard his grandfather's voice one last time. "Welcome to the crew, boy. Now the real fishing begins." In the morning, search and rescue would find Marcus's abandoned truck at the harbor. They searched for 3 days before calling off the operation. Another fisherman lost to the hungry waters of Bristol Bay. But old Pete knew better. Next summer, when the salmon ran thick and the midnight sun painted the water gold, Marcus would be back, walking across the waves in his yellow rain gear, calling to the next generation of fishermen. The bay always collected its debts, and the dead always came home.